This is the story of Patrick Fishy Fitzgerald, a boss behind the crimes happening in the streets of Dublin. His incredible ability to work from behind the shadows made him one of the most invincible names in Irish crime investigation. And even such a person like this had a beginning. But unlike normal gang life that grew from being a pawn to having influence in your gang, Fishy had a very unique path. A path that made him a crime lord with not even a single suspicion from the authorities. Patrick Fishy Fitzgerald. You see, back in 1998 and 1999, Fishy barely made any noise. He had his codes: keep your head down and stay quiet. These were the principles behind his super efficient ability to move through the shadows, even while the Gardaí were on a major rampage, shutting down big-time operations in the criminal world and hauling many gang lords to prison. Fishy was so good that he wasn't even suspected of being in a gang, nonetheless a gang lord. But this wasn't only by Gardaí. Other gangsters were also in the dark on this. His camouflage was perfect. He didn't dress flashy, never talked loudly. But no one could be that clean, and Fishy knew this. So he did something very genius. In his early years in crime activities, he filled his records with a few traffic violations here and there. And it worked well, because by 2005, when Fishy was still simply a rude guy to the Gardaí, Fishy had already walked his way up to owning a big gang. But one mistake almost brought the man in the shadows to the spotlight of investigation. In 2006, Fishy was driving and got pulled over by the Gardaí. He wasn't speeding or breaking any traffic rule, and the Gardaí wasn't stopping him for any crime, but for the usual random checks. But when Garda officers checked the car, they found something they never expected from the simple man. Inside the space where the spare tire usually goes, they found 48,000 euros in cash, neatly packed, like it was being moved. Fishy, trying to avert all suspicion, said it was money he earned legally from a side hustle. But the Criminal Assets Bureau didn't buy the lie. The Bureau, being good at what they did, were able to connect the cash to illegal activity, and because of this, they made him hand over almost 50,000 euros under court order. That one stop is believed by many to be the beginning of the crash of his criminal legacy. Now, even though Fishy was not a major suspect at this time, he had entered the detective radar. And it was just a matter of time before they would come knocking at his door. But if you think that a simple traffic stop would get Fishy, think again. Because Fishy didn't just continue his activity, rather, he upped his game, expanding a tight crew that took over the streets of Finglas. By 2010, Fishy's gang had increased to over 20 men. And Fishy, being the kind of person he was, had his strategy that drew less noise. His gang didn't go after the big catch. They didn't go after banks or empty warehouses. They only hit homes, regular middle-class homes in places like Ashbourne in County Meath, Naas in County Kildare, and Blanchardstown in Dublin. But Fishy wasn't kicking indoors. Rather, he was the one planning it all. But he wasn't doing it just for the money. Gardaí reported later that the robbery cash was being used to fund drug deals, another of Fishy's underground operations. But then Fishy made one of the biggest moves that would lead to a chain of wrong steps and eventually his downfall. And this was cocaine. Fishy got too deep into cocaine, becoming an addict. And that was when he began losing control. The formerly calm crime boss began having a bad temper, making his operations louder. Entire families in Finglas were scared into hiding drugs and guns in their homes. Some were so shaken, they moved away from the neighborhood completely. And although this earned them total control over the region, it had its own bigger backside, because the rampant crimes only brought Fishy out to the open, and this ended up making Gardaí come knocking. By 2012, detectives all over Dublin had Fishy's name on their desks, and soon the raids began. But it didn't just stop. At some point it got intense over the years, with the detectives hell bent on bringing Fishy down. And even though there were times Gardaí felt they got him, Fishy still had an ability up his sleeves, the ability to evade charges. Just like he did after a raid on a house connected to his gang that turned up a full cannabis grow house with more than 100 plants, a couple of firearms, and documents that pointed straight at Fishy. He managed to slip. And not only that, in 2014 again, there was another raid, and this time it was right near his own home. A fully loaded gun was found stashed in a neighbor's garden in Finglas South. Garda officers were sure it was his, but again, he wasn't arrested. Now there was no simple explanation to this. Fishy just had a way of escaping charges. The only reason that could be pointed to was how he performed his gang crimes. They left no fingerprints and no witness, so the Gardaí couldn't prove anything. Fishy was basically invincible. But this kind of invincibility had a way of raising suspicion, and soon backfired in the most painful way. With all the charges that Fishy was beating, they began asking questions. Because such unusual invincibility meant two things in the organized crime world. It was either he was working with Gardaí, or he was giving people up. But Fishy was doing none of that. But that didn't stop the trust in his gang for him to be broken that same year. Fishy's own crew turned on him. He was cornered, beaten up, and thrown out of his own gang. That was after they had stripped him of everything: his money, his status, everything. And for the first time in years, Fishy was actually vulnerable. And according to Fishy, it was during this time he quit cocaine. But Fishy didn't walk away from crime. Instead, he began doing things differently. Fishy again started moving quietly behind the scenes, but this time in a more tactful and different way. Younger criminals, especially the ones who didn't grow up during his most violent years, began looking up to him as their mentor, receiving advice from him. And from there, he made secret connections that helped him with running some things on the street. He even started getting close again with people who once worked for Eamon, the Don Dunn, a gang boss who was shot dead in 2007. He also rubbed shoulders with newer faces like Alan Bradley and Christopher Waldron, flashier guys who had money, cars, and bold reputations. But by this time, things had changed a whole lot, and backing younger crews now meant picking a side. And Fishy was made to pick a side during one of the worst gang wars Finglas had seen. On one side was Glenn Ward, known as Mr. Flashy, leader of the Gucci gang, with ties to the Kinahan cartel. On the other was James Whelan, known as Juan. He was more low-key and quiet, but every bit as dangerous. Fishy backed Juan's side. He didn't just offer only advice, but he mentored some of his coming-up crew members. Then came April 3rd, 2022. James Whelan was shot and killed on Deanstown Avenue in Finglas, Dublin. It happened late at night. People said they heard the gunfire echo through the estate. The shooting wasn't just a hit, it was a statement. Juan was the first gangland victim of the year, and his death sent a wave of fear through the city. Flashy survived, although he was later arrested. But things didn't calm down yet. A few months later, a new kind of attack made headlines. A drone carrying a pipe bomb flew over Finglas, heading straight for the house of one of Fishy's young protégés. But luckily, the bomb didn't go off. It missed the target. But the message was clear. And just as always, Fishy was in the center of this war, supporting the gang from the shadows. And this is where Gary Carey comes in. Gary Carey was a small-time drug dealer from Cherry Orchard, West Dublin. Nothing much, but he must have been linked to the gang wars, and by late 2021, a gang in Ballyfermot had decided they wanted him dead. And then it happened. On the night of November the 17th, 2021, Gary Carey stepped outside on Ballyfer Crescent. Then two men in a stolen black Opel Zafira pulled up fast and opened fire on Carey. Carey was hit in the stomach several times but somehow kept moving, bleeding badly. At first, Gardy didn't know Fishy was involved, but after a series of investigations, it was later discovered that Fishy planned most of the operation. He was responsible for the purchase of the cars used in the shooting, the Black Zafira and a Toyota Avensis. After the job, both cars were found burnt. The Zafira still had the 2 guns inside, but this time Gardy wasn't going to let him go. They followed camera footage, pulled phone data, and checked financial records, and slowly they built their case. Later in May 2025, it caught up to him. Fishy stood in court and admitted to part of the crime. He didn't confess to attempted murder. Instead, he pleaded guilty to helping a criminal gang try to kill Gary Carey. But that was not all. While Fitzgerald was still out on bail for a crime he had committed back in August 2023, he jumped back into violence. But this one was like back in the days. The usual home invasion and robbery in Templeogue, a quiet residential neighborhood in South Dublin. Fishy wasn't alone. He teamed up with another criminal, someone he had worked with before. They had a lead on a huge amount of money stolen by a former bank employee that was kept in that house. The victims of the robbery were a married couple in their 70s, their adult daughter, and a 6-year-old granddaughter. The gang broke in, tied them up, and ransacked the entire house. They were looking for the cash, but there was no hidden money. After investigation, and Fishy was found to be the perpetrator, the case came up in court. When the case was thrown at Fishy, it was unexpected. Even his lawyers couldn't clean it up. His only excuse was that he wasn't the lead guy, and begged for leniency. They begged the court not to combine his charges and argued that a heavy sentence would be too much for him at his age. But the judge didn't hold back. In February 2025, he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for the Templeogue home invasion. And with the Gary Carey case still open, there's a real chance his time behind bars will stretch much longer. His previous charge was also applied this time, sentencing him to an extra 9 years in prison for conspiring with gang members and aiding their getaway. With a total of 15.5 years of jail time at the age of 48, Patrick "Fishy" Fitzgerald went down, not as a shiny hero of street gangs or a crime boss, but as an old man whose sins finally caught up with him. What do you think of this crime story? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.